Imagine an ordinary afternoon in a small American town. People rushing through their shopping, living their routines. In the midst of this crowd, an elderly woman, frail and alone, barely counting the little money she has to pay for basic groceries. What should have been a simple moment in her day turns into a scene of public humiliation. She's judged, ridiculed, and no one does anything. No one except a stranger, a man who, without saying much, decides to step in. But what happens next is far more than a simple act of kindness. Get ready for a story filled with emotional twists, where secrets from the past are revealed, and one unexpected act of courage forever changes the life of a woman forgotten by time. What begins as a cruel humiliation ends in a way that no one could have ever imagined. This is a story that will hold your attention until the very last second, and what happens after will shock you. It was an ordinary afternoon in the small town of Brentwood, in the heartland of the United States. The weather was pleasant, and the local grocery store was buzzing with activity. Betty Thompson, a 75-year-old woman, slowly made her way down the aisle. She moved carefully, as she always did, making sure not to stumble against the shelves overflowing with products. Betty didn't need much, just a bit of bread, milk, and maybe a few apples, if she had enough money. She was a familiar face in town, but lately, she felt invisible. As she approached the cashier, she felt that familiar knot in her stomach, something she always felt when she had to pay for her groceries with small change. While she placed her items on the counter, the young cashier, Amber, looked at her with impatience. "Is that all?" Amber's question came out laced with a hint of irony. Betty was silent for a moment. The words hit her like a blow. Her trembling fingers fumbled for the crumpled notes inside her purse, while people in line began to murmur. She could feel the eyes on her back, a weight that seemed to crush her. Finally, she managed to pull out the money and handed it to the cashier. But Amber looked at the amount, and then, with a malicious smile, announced loudly, "You're short." Betty's heart raced. She rummaged through her purse again, but she knew there was nothing left. The silence around her was broken by the impatient whispers of other customers. "Always the same," someone muttered behind her. Betty tried to speak, but shame kept her words trapped. She wanted to disappear, to vanish right there, and then, but before she could make any move, a firm voice echoed through the store. "How much is missing?" Everyone turned to look. A tall man, with a serious expression, stood beside Betty. He addressed the cashier, his eyes fixed on Amber. "How much is missing?" he repeated, his voice lower, but with undeniable authority. Amber hesitated for a moment, the smirk vanishing from her face. Amber, visibly unsettled, looked at the register and stammered, "It's $2.50. Without another word, the man pulled out his wallet. With a quick, firm motion, he handed a $5 bill to Amber. "Keep the change." Betty looked at him, surprised and emotional, her eyes welling up with gratitude. She tried to speak, but her voice came out faint. I don't know how to thank you." Her words wavered as tears filled her eyes. The man just smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile. "No thanks needed, ma'am. Everyone deserves respect." The line, which had been restless before, fell completely silent. The people who had murmured against Betty now seemed ashamed. No one dared to say anything. Amber, embarrassed, handed the change to the man without looking him in the eyes. He took the coins and gently placed them in Betty's hand. "You might need this later." Betty, still stunned, just nodded, speechless. She gathered her bags, still trembling, and left the store. But as she walked out, the image of the stranger lingered in her mind. Who was he? And why? Out of all the people in that store, was he the one who helped her? That night, Betty couldn't sleep well. She stared at the ceiling of her small bedroom, the quiet of the night amplifying her worries. Why did that man help her? Who was he? She remembered his firm gaze, the way he confronted the cashier without hesitation. He was a complete stranger, but for some reason, he made her feel safe. Betty had lived alone for years, ever since her husband, Henry, passed away. Since then, she faced life on her own, dealing with daily challenges as best as she could. But that day at the grocery store, something had shifted. As the cold wind tapped against her window, Betty wondered if she would ever see that man again. She wanted to thank him properly. But more than that, she wanted to understand what made him step in. Deep down, Betty knew that encounter wasn't just a simple act of kindness. There was something more, something she couldn't yet comprehend. The next morning, Betty decided to return to the grocery store. Not that she needed anything else, but something was pulling her back to that place. As she walked through town, people looked at her differently. It wasn't like before, when her steps went unnoticed. Now, she felt curious and sometimes even guilty glances. The gossip about what had happened at the grocery store had already spread throughout the town. In Brentwood, nothing stayed secret for long. When she entered the store, Betty was greeted with reserved smiles and an uncomfortable silence. Amber, the young cashier, avoided looking directly at her. Betty felt a mixture of shame and relief. She didn't want to be the center of attention, but she couldn't ignore what she felt either. As she walked down the aisles, her eyes searched for the mysterious man. But he wasn't there. Betty sighed, picked up a few small items, and went to the register. This time, Amber made no comments. She just rang up the items in silence. Betty paid quickly and left the store, feeling that something was still about to happen. 2 days passed, and Betty couldn't stop thinking about the man who helped her. She felt grateful, but also curious, and a little lost. Who was he? Finally, on a chilly morning, Betty decided to walk through the town park. It was a quiet place where she used to stroll with Henry. She sat down on a wooden bench, watching the leaves slowly fall from the surrounding trees. And then she saw him, the same man from the store, walking slowly along the trail, his hands in his pockets, eyes downcast. Betty hesitated for a moment, but her desire to speak to him was stronger. She stood up, walking towards him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shy but determined. The man stopped, raising his eyes to meet hers. "I wanted to thank you," she continued, with a timid smile. "For that day at the store, I wouldn't have managed without your help." The man smiled, a warm and gentle smile. "There's no need to thank me, ma'am," he replied. "I just did what anyone should do." Betty shook her head, her eyes reflecting gratitude. "Not everyone would do what you did. It was much more than just paying for my groceries." The man looked at her for a long moment, as if considering her words. Then he answered, "Sometimes, what seems small to us can mean the world to someone else." Betty fell silent, absorbing those words. She knew there was more to this story, and she was determined to find out. As the days went by, Betty and the man, who she learned was named Jack, started to meet regularly at the park. They didn't talk much, but when they did, Betty felt a deep connection. Jack wasn't just a stranger who helped her. He had a story. One afternoon, as they walked side by side, Betty finally mustered the courage to ask, "Why did you do that for me, Jack? I feel like it wasn't just out of courtesy." Jack stopped, looking out at the horizon before responding. "My mother," he began, his voice slightly trembling. "She went through the same thing you did. Many years ago, when I was a kid. No one helped her." Betty listened intently, her heart tightening. Jack continued, his gaze distant. "I promised myself that if I ever saw someone facing the same humiliation, I wouldn't just stand by." His words struck deep within Betty. The days continued to pass, and the meetings between Betty and Jack in the park became a ritual. Each morning, Betty would wake up early, filled with anticipation, and make her way to the same bench as always. She knew that, sooner or later, Jack would show up. He always did. Their conversations ranged from lighthearted topics, like the weather, to deeper stories about their lives. Betty began to share stories about her late husband, Henry, and the challenges she faced after he passed. "He was my rock," she said, her eyes distant. "After he left, I felt like I was drifting, lost in a sea of responsibilities I didn't know how to handle." Jack listened closely, his eyes focused on her every word. "Sometimes, loneliness isn't about being alone," Betty continued in a low voice. "It's about feeling like no one cares." Jack remained silent for a moment, considering Betty's words. Then he sighed, as if carefully choosing what to say. "I get that," he murmured. "Loneliness has a way of hiding in places where we least expect it." Betty looked at him, surprised by the depth of his thoughts. Do you feel like that too, Jack? He hesitated for a second, but then responded, Sometimes. I think everyone feels that way once in a while. Betty smiled softly. Somehow, knowing that even Jack, with all his strength, wrestled with his own demons made her feel less alone. During one of their walks in the park, Jack decided to open up more about his past with Betty. It was as if, little by little, he was learning to trust her. My mother was a simple woman, he began. She worked as a cleaning lady, always trying to do the best for us. But life was tough on her. My dad left us early, and she had to make it on her own. Betty listened quietly, her eyes fixed on Jack's face. I remember one time, he continued, I must have been around 12. We were at a store. She was counting out coins like you, Betty, and the cashier made a nasty comment. Something about poor folks. She just lowered her head and took it. Jack paused, clearly affected by the memory. In that moment, I wanted to say something to stand up for my mother, but I was just a kid, and even now, I blame myself for not doing anything. Betty placed her hand gently on Jack's arm. You were just a boy, Jack. It wasn't your responsibility. But now, you're doing for others what you wish you could have done for her. That's powerful. Jack nodded, but the weight of the memory was still evident on his face. I don't want anyone else to go through what my mother did, he said softly. Betty smiled, moved by Jack's vulnerability. And you won't let that happen, because you have a heart that cares. And that, Jack, makes all the difference. They sat in silence for a while, taking in the gravity of their conversation. In that moment, something shifted between them. They were no longer just casual acquaintances. They were souls who, in their own ways, were healing each other's wounds. As Betty and Jack spent more time together, Betty began to feel a shift inside herself. It was as though, in some way, she was waking up from a long slumber. The loneliness that once weighed her down started to lift. She realized that, for the first time in many years, she didn't feel quite so alone. One afternoon, while she was at home, Betty gazed out of her small living room window and found herself smiling for no reason. There was a lightness in her heart, something she hadn't felt since Henry's passing. Who would have thought, she murmured to herself, that a simple trip to the grocery store would change so much. Betty started to engage more with the local community. She participated in events at the church, went to the town cafe, and spoke with other people. She was no longer the invisible woman who went unnoticed. Jack had helped her see that there was still much value in her life, that she still had so much to give to the world. Yet, a part of Betty still worried. What if Jack left? What if he disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared? These thoughts haunted her sometimes, but Betty knew she needed to live in the moment and appreciate the time she had with him. She reminded herself that some people enter our lives for a reason, even if their time is fleeting. And no matter what, Betty was grateful for the chance to feel alive again. A few days later, while Betty was in her small living room, the phone rang. Startled, she picked up the receiver, wondering who could be calling her at that time of the day. Hello, she answered hesitantly, holding her breath. Hi, is this Mrs. Thompson? A woman's voice spoke, formal and serious. Yes, this is she. Who's speaking? Betty replied, her heart racing. I'm calling from the Brentwood Nursing Association. We received a recommendation for a special program, and we'd like to offer you assistance with grocery deliveries. It seems like someone has spoken highly of you and mentioned that you could use a little extra help. Betty froze. The only person she had spoken to about her challenges recently was Jack. Could it be him? She felt a mixture of emotions, gratitude, curiosity, and an ache in her heart. Who recommended me? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. There was a pause on the other end of the line before the woman answered. He didn't leave a name, but he insisted that you deserve this kindness. He said that people should look out for each other. Betty's eyes filled with tears. She knew then, without a doubt, that it was Jack. Thank you, she whispered into the phone. Please, tell him, whoever he is, that I appreciate it more than he knows. After hanging up, Betty sat down at her kitchen table, her hands trembling. Jack's gesture was small, but it meant the world to her. It wasn't just about groceries. It was about being seen, being cared for. But why hadn't he told her about this himself? The question gnawed at her as she tried to understand his motivations. The next morning, Betty decided to do something she hadn't done in a long time. She put on her best coat, fixed her hair, and made her way to Mason's Cafe, the quaint little coffee shop in downtown Brentwood. It was the kind of place where the whole town gathered, where stories and gossip flowed freely over cups of steaming coffee. As she stepped through the door, Betty immediately noticed a few curious glances in her direction. People had heard about the scene at the grocery store, and whispers still lingered. But Betty held her head high, determined not to let their opinions affect her. She walked up to the counter and ordered a cup of tea. The barista, Sam, gave her a warm smile as he handed over the drink. "Good to see you, Mrs. Thompson. How have you been?" he asked, his tone friendly. "Better, Sam. Thank you," she replied, her lips curling into a small smile. Betty took her tea and found a seat by the window, watching the familiar scene of the town going about its day. She sipped the warm liquid, letting it soothe her nerves. Just as she was beginning to feel more at ease, she noticed Jack through the window. He was walking past the cafe, his expression distant and pensive. Betty quickly got up, her heart racing. She rushed to the door, hoping to catch him before he disappeared down the street. "Jack," she called out, her voice carrying a mix of urgency and hope. He turned around, surprise flashing across his face when he saw her. He smiled, but there was a shadow behind his eyes that Betty hadn't noticed before. "Betty, what are you doing here?" he asked as she approached him, still holding her cup of tea. "I could ask you the same thing," she replied with a playful grin. "But more importantly, thank you. I know it was you who arranged for the groceries." Jack's smile faltered for a moment, and he looked away. "It was nothing, Betty. I just thought you could use a little help." She reached out, gently touching his arm to catch his attention. "It's not nothing. It's everything to me," she said sincerely. "But why didn't you tell me?" Jack sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. Sometimes it's easier to do things quietly, without expecting anything in return. Betty studied his face, sensing that there was more behind those words than he was letting on. But before she could press him further, Jack straightened up and forced a smile. "I'm glad you're here, Betty. It's good to see you out and about." She wanted to ask more, to dig deeper into what troubled him, but Jack quickly changed the subject, and they continued walking together through the town, pretending that everything was normal. But Betty couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, Jack invited Betty for another walk in the park. The leaves had started to turn golden, signaling the approach of autumn. The air was crisp, and a light breeze rustled through the trees. As they strolled along the familiar path, Betty noticed that Jack seemed more withdrawn than usual. He kept glancing at the ground, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. Finally, she couldn't hold back her curiosity any longer. "Jack, is everything all right? You seem different lately." He stopped walking and turned to face her, the wind tugging at his hair. For a moment, he looked like he was struggling with himself, as if deciding whether to speak or keep things hidden. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't want you to know, but I'm leaving, Betty. I have to go away for a while." Betty's heart sank. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, leaving her breathless. "Leaving? Why? Where are you going?" she asked, panic creeping in her voice. Jack's expression softened, but there was a sadness in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "There are things I need to take care of, things I can't avoid anymore. I wish I could stay, Betty, but it's out of my hands." Betty shook her head, feeling a desperation she hadn't felt in years. "But what about us? We've only just started to." She couldn't finish her sentence, her throat tightening with emotion. Jack stepped closer, reaching out to take her hand. His touch was warm, but it did little to soothe the cold fear settling in Betty's chest. "Betty, you've brought more light into my life than you realize. But some paths we have to walk alone, and this is one of those paths for me." Tears welled up in Betty's eyes, but she forced herself to smile, even through the pain. "I understand, Jack. I'll miss you." He pulled her into a gentle hug, holding her tightly, as if trying to memorize the moment. "I'll miss you too, Betty. More than you know." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's warmth, while the autumn leaves swirled around them. Betty knew that no matter what happened, she wouldn't forget this moment, nor would she forget Jack. And as they parted that day, she realized that some goodbyes come with a promise, even if unspoken. a promise that the impact of their time together would last far longer than the parting itself. After her conversation with Jack, Betty's mind was a whirl of emotions. She tried to stay strong, but the thought of him leaving Brentwood weighed heavily on her heart. She continued with her daily routine, hoping to find solace in the small comforts of life. A warm cup of tea, a walk through the town, a friendly chat with her neighbors. But it didn't take long for word of Jack's departure to spread through Brentwood. In a town as small as this, secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. One afternoon, Betty visited Rose's bakery, a place where locals gathered not just for pastries, but for the latest gossip. She overheard bits and pieces of conversations as she waited in line, her ears perking up when she heard Jack's name. "Did you hear? Jack is leaving town," a woman whispered to her friend at a nearby table. "Yeah, I heard he has some trouble to take care of elsewhere." "Shame though, he was a good guy," the other replied. Betty couldn't help but feel a pang of irritation. They spoke about Jack like he was a character in some story, not a person with real struggles. She tried to ignore it, but curiosity got the best of her. When she approached the counter, she casually asked Rose, the owner, if she had heard anything about Jack. Rose gave her a sympathetic look as she placed a warm cinnamon roll into a bag. "People are saying all sorts of things, Betty, but you know how this town is, always quick to judge. They say he has some family issues to sort out back in Chicago, but no one really knows for sure. He's a private man." Betty thanked Rose and left the bakery with a heavy heart. The thought of Jack returning to Chicago without telling her the whole story gnawed at her. She wanted to believe that he trusted her, that he saw her as more than just a stranger he had helped. But she knew there was a part of his life he was keeping hidden, a part that she couldn't reach. She decided then that she would find out the truth, even if it meant confronting Jack one last time before he left. A few days later, Betty returned to the park, hoping to see Jack again before he left town for good. She arrived early, sitting on their usual bench beneath the oak tree, and waited. Hours passed, but Jack did not appear. Betty began to lose hope, thinking perhaps he had already left without saying goodbye. Just as she was about to give up, she saw him in the distance, walking slowly along the trail. He seemed distracted, his steps unsteady. "Jack," she called out, her voice carrying through the cool air. He turned at the sound of her voice, surprise flashing in his eyes. For a moment, he looked as if he might walk away, but then he sighed and made his way toward her. "Betty, I wasn't expecting to see you here," he said, stopping a few feet away from the bench. Betty stood up, facing him with a determination she rarely showed. "Why didn't you tell me the truth, Jack? Why are you really leaving?" Jack's expression tightened, and he looked away, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "I told you, Betty. There are things I have to take care of, things you wouldn't understand." Betty's voice softened, but the firmness remained. "Try me. I think I deserve to know the truth after everything." Jack hesitated, the tension clear in the set of his jaw. Finally, he met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. "I'm not just leaving, Betty. I'm running," he confessed. "I have debts back in Chicago, bad ones. People I owe money to, people who don't take kindly to waiting. I thought I could make a fresh start here, but they found me." Betty's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, hadn't imagined that Jack was living under such a threat. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Maybe I could have helped," she said, her voice trembling. Jack shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. "There's nothing you could do, Betty. This is my mess, and I have to clean it up on my own. I've already put you at enough risk just by being around you." Betty felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let him see her cry. "You're not alone, Jack. You don't have to face this alone." Jack's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked like he might accept her offer of help. But then, he stepped back, shaking his head. "You don't understand. These people, they don't play fair. It's better this way, Betty. Safer for you." With those words, he turned and walked away, leaving Betty standing alone in the park, the wind carrying away the last of her hopes. After their encounter in the park, Betty couldn't sleep. The image of Jack's pained expression and his hurried departure haunted her. She knew that if he left Brentwood without resolving his troubles, he might never find peace or safety. Desperation driving her, Betty made a decision. She reached out to Sheriff Collins, an old friend who had known her and Henry for years. She explained the situation as best as she could, leaving out the more dangerous details that Jack had shared. "Sheriff, I know Jack hasn't been in town long, but he's a good man. He's just gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd," she pleaded, her hands trembling. "Is there anything you can do to help him?" Sheriff Collins listened quietly, leaning back in his creaky office chair. He stroked his mustache, considering her words. "Betty, you know I've always had a soft spot for you, but this is a complicated situation. If Jack has trouble with people outside of town, there's only so much I can do without overstepping. But I'll see what I can find out, see if there's a way to keep him safe if he stays." Betty's shoulders sagged with relief, and she reached out to squeeze the sheriff's hand. "Thank you, Collins. It means more than you know." She left the sheriff's office with a small glimmer of hope in her chest. But as she made her way back home, she found Jack waiting on her doorstep, his expression stormy. "What did you do, Betty?" he demanded, his voice low and strained. Betty flinched at the anger in his tone, but she held her ground. "I went to the sheriff. I asked him for help. I couldn't just sit back and let you run off into danger." Jack's face turned pale, and he shook his head, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "You shouldn't have done that. Now they'll know. Now they'll know you're involved." Betty reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "I did it because I care, Jack. You're not in this alone anymore." Jack's shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, shuddering breath. For a moment, he looked like a man who had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, finally finding a moment of reprieve. "You're a stubborn woman, Betty Thompson," he said, a hint of a smile breaking through the tension. Betty returned the smile, though her eyes were still filled with worry. "And you're a fool if you think you can push me away so easily." Jack let out a laugh, a genuine one this time, and for a moment, it felt like the clouds hanging over them had parted just a little. But they both knew that the real challenge was yet to come. As they stood together on that quiet street, they made a silent promise to face whatever came next side by side, no matter the cost. The next few days in Brentwood were filled with a tense calm. Betty could feel it in the air, like the moment before a storm. Jack tried to keep a low profile, but the shadow of his past loomed larger than ever. Betty's worry for him grew with each passing day, and she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, Betty found herself standing on her porch, staring out at the dusty road leading into town. Jack had promised to meet her for dinner, but he was late, too late. Anxiety gnawed at her insides, and she felt her hands begin to tremble. She was about to head back inside when she saw him in the distance, walking slowly up the road. But something was wrong. His movements were sluggish, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to be following him. Betty's heart skipped a beat. She ran down the steps of her porch, rushing to meet him halfway. When she reached him, she saw the fear in his eyes, fear that he had tried so hard to keep hidden from her. "Jack, what happened?" she demanded, her voice cracking with worry. He shook his head, his face pale in the twilight. "They're here, Betty. The people I owe. They found me." Betty felt her blood run cold. She looked around, half expecting to see shadowy figures lurking nearby, but the streets were empty, eerily quiet. "We need to get you out of here," she said, grabbing his arm with a strength she didn't know she had. "We can hide you until they leave, or—" Jack pulled away gently, his expression filled with a sorrow that made her chest ache. "It's too late for that, Betty. They're not going to leave until they get what they want. And I can't keep putting you in danger. This is my mess to clean up." Betty's eyes welled up with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She reached out, cupping Jack's face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You don't get to make that decision alone. Jack, you came into my life and turned it upside down, and now you think you can just disappear? I don't care what trouble you brought with you. I'm staying right here with you." Jack's eyes softened, and for a moment, he seemed like he might break down. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes as if savoring the brief comfort she offered. "You've got a heart bigger than this whole town, Betty Thompson," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "But you deserve better than this. Better than me." Betty shook her head, a fierce determination blazing in her eyes. "You don't get to decide what I deserve, Jack. I choose to be here with you, come what may. Just then, the sound of an engine cut through the silence, and Betty turned to see a dark sedan creeping down the road toward them. Her grip on Jack tightened, and she felt his body tense beside her. "That's them," Jack murmured, his voice barely more than a breath. Before Betty could react, the car came to a stop a few yards away. 3 men stepped out, their faces shadowed under the dim streetlights. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Jack. "Time's up, Jack. We've given you enough chances," he called out, his voice cold and hard as steel. Jack straightened, stepping protectively in front of Betty. His voice was steady, but she could hear the fear beneath it. "I'll go with you. Just leave her out of this." Betty pushed past him, stepping forward with a courage that surprised even herself. "No, if you want him, you'll have to go through me," she said, her voice carrying through the still evening air. The men exchanged looks, clearly caught off guard by the defiant old woman standing between them and their target. For a moment, it seemed like they might actually back down. But then, the man with the scar sneered. "This isn't your business, lady. Walk away before you get hurt." Betty didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on the man's. "I've been alone for a long time," she said, her voice trembling but fierce. "I've learned that you can't run from your past, but you can face it with the right people by your side. Jack saved me when I had nothing left. Now it's my turn to save him." For a moment, there was silence. The men stared at her, as if they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. And then, unexpectedly, one of them, a younger man with a scruffy beard, lowered his head, his expression softening. "Let's just take him and go," he muttered to the leader. "She's right. This doesn't have to be messy." The scarred man hesitated, clearly torn between his instincts and the unexpected show of decency from his partner. Finally, he sighed, spitting onto the ground. "Fine, but this is the last favor, Jack. Get your life together, or next time, no one will be able to save you." With a final glare, he nodded to the other men, and they returned to the car. The engine roared to life, and within moments, the car disappeared down the road, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Betty let out a shaky breath, feeling her legs nearly give out beneath her. Jack caught her, pulling her into a tight embrace, and she clung to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I thought I was going to lose you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Jack held her close, his breath warm against her hair. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known, Betty. I don't deserve you, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to." They stood like that, wrapped in each other's arms, while the sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the town in darkness. But for the first time in a long time, Betty didn't fear the night. She knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The next morning, as the first rays of dawn crept over the hills of Brentwood, Betty woke up to the smell of coffee brewing in her kitchen. Jack was there, making breakfast with a smile on his face that she had never seen before, one that was free of the burdens he had carried for so long. "Good morning, sunshine," he greeted her, placing a plate of toast and eggs on the table. Betty couldn't help but laugh, a sound that felt foreign yet wonderful to her ears. "Good morning, Jack. What's gotten into you?" she teased, taking a seat. He sat across from her, reaching out to hold her hand. "Hope, Betty. For the first time in years, I've got hope. And it's all because of you." They ate breakfast together, talking and laughing as the sun rose higher in the sky. For the first time in years, Betty felt like she had a future to look forward to, one where she wasn't alone. And as they sat together, with the promise of a new beginning hanging in the air, Betty knew that the pain of the past, the fear of being invisible, was finally behind her. She had found something she never thought she'd find again: family, hope, and a reason to keep on going. And in Jack's eyes, she saw the same thing: a man who had been given a second chance at life, a chance to start over with someone who saw the good in him when no one else did. They didn't know what the future held, but as they faced it together, hand in hand, they were ready for whatever came next. Thank you for accompanying Betty and Jack on this emotional journey. If you have any thoughts or want to hear more, feel free to let me know.